Según los historiadores, ese 30 de abril Hitler se suicidó, pero más adelante entraremos en detalles sobre lo que pasó en ese búnker. La noche del 1 de mayo, una radio alemana anunció que Hitler había muerto y el 2 de mayo el Ejército Rojo tomó completamente Berlín. Sin embargo, el cuerpo de Hitler no aparecía, y eso dio pie a múltiples versiones sobre las últimas horas del líder nazi. De hecho, en junio del 45, 2 meses después, las autoridades soviéticas dijeron que no habían podido encontrar los restos de Hitler, y no solo eso, insinuaron que podría seguir con vida.
Adolf Hitler, one of the most important figures in modern history, died on April 30th, 1945, as he came to terms with the shattering of his dream of an eternal Third Reich. With its central figure gone, Nazi Germany plunged into a turbulent period from which it would not emerge for years. Mass arrests and executions were just some of the events that occurred during this dark time for the German people. Meanwhile, the fear of Hitler's resurgence lingered. There is no doubt about his death. The evidence is conclusive. There are clear indications that his body was transported far from Berlin. So why were there so many rumors about his survival? What led to this? Today in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about Hitler's death and its consequences in Germany and the world. In the final days of April 1945, the European front of the Second World War was coming to an end. German troops were being attacked simultaneously by the Allies in the West and the Soviets in the East. All the territory they had conquered in recent years had been liberated, and now the battles were being fought on their own soil. Berlin was besieged by the Red Army, while German soldiers tried to resist desperately. With a shortage of ammunition, no armored vehicles, outnumbered, and morale destroyed, everyone knew that the end of the Third Reich was inevitable. Everyone except Hitler. He and his most fanatical followers still believed that a miraculous Nazi victory was possible. In his underground bunker in the German capital, the Führer continued to issue increasingly difficult orders to fulfill. On April 22nd, all of Hitler's hopes rested on Commander Felix Steiner. The man was supposed to break through the Soviet encirclement around Berlin and thus relieve the beleaguered defenders. But Steiner made it clear that, due to the small number of his men, this action would not be feasible. When Hitler learned of this, all of his resolve collapsed. It was at this moment that he realized the war was over and that he was on the losing side. From here, according to those present during the scene, he began to plan his death. Let's hear from his secretary describing the mood of the Nazi leader during those days.
Es gab keinen Angriff mehr, es gab keine Verteidigung mehr. Und dann hat Hitler alle Hoffnung verloren und hat sich zurückgezogen, hat sich in sich selbst zurückgezogen, wurde vollkommen stumpf, teilnahmslos, saß im Korridor mit einem von den jungen Hunden, die Blondie hatte nämlich inzwischen Junge bekommen, die waren da auch noch in dem Bunker, in einem Nebenraum, so in einem Waschraum untergebracht, hat den Welpen auf dem Schoß und hat stumpf vor sich hingestarrt.
In the following days, the German situation rapidly worsened. The Russians were getting closer and closer to the city center, and the defenders were dying in droves, unable to hold back the enemy advance. The general's predictions spoke of a catastrophe. Berlin could hold out at the latest until 30 April. Hitler received the reports in silence, his course of action already resolved. He informed his followers of his decision, making it clear that the surrender of the German army was not a viable option. They must fight to the last man. A day earlier, the Nazi leader had married his mistress, Eva Braun. She had traveled from Munich to Berlin to be with the Führer in his most desperate moments. And now, despite being given the option to flee, she chose to share her husband's fate. Hitler's last order was to burn his corpse in bronze, leaving almost no trace of it. Then their remains were to be buried. He did not want to suffer the same fate as his ally, the dictator Benito Mussolini. He and his mistress had been captured by partisans just 2 days earlier. After their arrest, they were shot, and their bodies mutilated and paraded through the streets of Italy. Hitler did not want to go through this humiliation. After bidding farewell to the few remaining party members in the bunker and giving them permission to flee if they so wished, the Führer locked himself in his room with his wife. It was not long before a single shot was heard echoing through the underground shelter. When his followers opened the door, they found him dead from a bullet wound to the temple. Eva Braun, lying on the armchair, had also died from taking a cyanide capsule. This was the death of the greatest architect of the Second World War. But despite the Führer's the Battle of Berlin continued. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi Party's propaganda minister, inherited the position of Chancellor of Germany and reiterated Hitler's orders forbidding surrender to the enemy. The capital would be defended to the last drop of blood, but Goebbels would not be part of this fight. Along with his wife Magda, they gave each of their 6 children a morphine injection, under the pretext of protecting them from infection. While sedated and sleeping, they murdered them with cyanide capsules. For the couple, a world without Hitler was not worth living in. We can once again hear from Hitler's secretary, who witnessed this macabre event.
Den Kindern ist gesagt worden, ihr müsst geimpft werden, wenn ihr so nahe beim Onkel Hitler lebt und in dem Bunker, wo so viele Menschen sind. Aber ich habe oft das Gefühl gehabt, dass die Älteste, die Helga, die war ja schon 10, die hatte so traurige Augen und so, die war so still und ich habe das Gefühl, dieses Kind hat irgendwelche Ahnungen gehabt. Es war furchtbar.
Only hours later, Goebbels shot his wife and then put a bullet in his own temple. Once again, the Reich lost its leader. With Hitler and the propaganda minister dead, Nazism found itself without its 2 greatest fanatics. The generals in charge of the forces saw no reason to fight on and sought to sign a surrender with the Soviet Union. It was during these negotiations that Stalin learned of the Führer's death. But his paranoid nature made him distrust this information, and he did not reveal it publicly. Instead, he ordered Smersh, the Soviet counterintelligence unit, to thoroughly search the underground bunker for his supposed corpse. These men came upon a chilling scene. Numerous Reich generals, perhaps too proud to try to escape, were found dead by their own hands in the corridors. In one of the rooms, the Goebbels' son and daughters lay, murdered by their own parents. They found them in the courtyard, just outside the bunker. Although the propaganda minister had also given the order to burn his body and that of his wife, enough of them had been preserved for identification. But there was no trace of the Führer. They had to keep searching. However, the fighting in the city was not over yet. While the leaders of both sides were discussing the terms of German capitulation, the bloodthirsty Red Army was taking its brutal revenge on the civilian population. Any robbery, rape, or murder they committed against citizens was seen as justified based on the crimes the Nazis had carried out on Soviet soil in the previous years. It is difficult to know exactly how many people died or fell victim to these acts, but it is estimated that approximately 100,000 women were sexually abused by Russian men. Many of them, out of shame or trauma, would end up taking their own lives. These were not the only that occurred in Berlin around this time. It could even be said that not only was this a common act, but it was encouraged by the Nazi leadership. For them, committing was an act of honor, whereas surrendering to the Soviets marked one as a coward and a traitor. During this battle, one of the last fought in Europe, it is estimated that almost 4,000 people took their own lives, both civilians and military personnel. Several high-ranking generals, knowing what would happen to them if they fell into Soviet hands, chose this fate. Many of them killed their families first. In many cases, Berliners, motivated by German propaganda, also saw it preferable to die than to be Russian prisoners. As mentioned above, not everything that was said was Nazi fabrications. Wherever the Red Army passed, terrible atrocities were committed against the civilian population under the pretext of seeking revenge. This did not happen only in Berlin. In the German town of Demmin, for example, around 2,000 people committed suicide because of Soviet actions. This number may not seem so high, but it represented only a little less than 10% of the population of the place. Let us listen to a witness from this village.
Fue la primera vez que vi muertos. Colgaban de los manzanos que habían empezado a florecer. Nosotros correteábamos alrededor, robábamos aquí y allá y veíamos cadáveres flotando en el río.
Some believe that many of these had another darker reason. Historians have theories that some people decided to take their own lives because they could not imagine a world without Nazism, or because of the trauma they suffered from battles or Soviet atrocities, but others may have done so because they feared Holocaust retaliation. Contrary to what was once believed, many civilians were aware of what was happening in the concentration camps of Eastern Europe. Many, immersed in the ideology of the party, even supported it. They knew that when these crimes against humanity came to light, they would not be forgiven by the rest of the world. Out of guilt, fear, or shame, they made the drastic decision to end their existence. Germany's unconditional surrender would finally happen on May 8, 1945. The fighting came to an end, although the crimes against the civilian population and the continued for a longer time. Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS and one of Hitler's most powerful lieutenants, committed suicide following his capture by the Allies later this month. Martin Bormann, the Führer's personal secretary, also chose this option when his escape from Berlin became difficult. The remaining Nazi leaders, such as Hermann Göring and Karl Dönitz, were imprisoned and would be put on trial in the following months. 601 people were tried at the Nuremberg trials. 11 of them were sentenced to death. Other Nazis of lower rank than these leaders, but no less important, managed to escape. Many went to South America, mainly to Argentina, as was the case of the Dr. Josef Mengele, famous for carrying out inhuman experiments at Auschwitz. However, other officials, mostly scientists, were invited to the United States or the United Kingdom by their own governments, with the intelligence services planning the escapes. Sometimes even the Catholic Church assisted in these escapes, sheltering the criminals in Italian monasteries, sometimes for years. Countries that until very recently were their mortal enemies now offered them work in the development of new weapons, with the intention of stopping the advance of an upcoming rival, communism, led by the Soviet Union. However, Nazis who were of no use to the Western powers, or who were accused of the most serious crimes, were still sought for trial and conviction. One of them was Adolf Hitler himself. Remember that information about the Führer's death had been jealously guarded by Stalin, who did not tell his European allies. He even ordered his intelligence services to fuel rumors of his escape and to brand any claim of his suicide as a fascist trick. In reality, the Soviet leader was almost certain that he had found Hitler's remains, just a few days after the end of the Battle of Berlin. Interrogating the few survivors who had remained in the bunker in the capital, they found the place where the German dictator and his wife had been buried. Although the remains found were few and mostly disintegrated when touched, the dentures remained in relatively good condition. They were quickly ordered to be taken to a surgical hospital for examination. Thanks to the questioning of one of the Nazi leader's surviving doctors, the Soviets came up with the name of his dentist. They didn't find him, but they did find his assistant. She confirmed that the dental records found in the courtyard of the Berlin bunker matched Hitler's, so there was no longer any doubt. The Führer was dead, and his remains were in Russian hands. But that was not what Stalin was saying. At the end of May, he told the US ambassador in Moscow that he believed Hitler had managed to escape without a trace. Perhaps, he said, he had fled to Japan seeking refuge with his allies, or to Spain, where the fascist dictator Francisco Franco had given him shelter. The Red Army generals were also under orders to foster this idea that the Nazi leader was still at large. It was all a ploy to gain a better position than his anti-communist Western rivals. For Stalin, power came from information, as two historians state in the following video.
Почему Сталин не сообщает союзникам?
Warum ließ Stalin seine Verbündeten im Dunkeln?
Здесь больше психологии,
Das ist
может
etwas
быть, чем,
kompliziert und hat psychologische
формальной
Gründe.
логики. Psychologisch,
Ein Wissensvorsprung ist
знать
stets
то,
von
что не
Vorteil.
знают другие, это всегда хорошо.
Es kann immer nützlich sein, ein
Обладать тайной,
Geheimnis zu
которой не
haben.
обладают другие, это всегда хорошо.
Die Geschichte um Hitlers Tod zeigt, wie misstrauisch Stalin dem Westen gegenüber war. Es war ihm wichtig, nicht zu viele Informationen oder Beweise weiterzugeben. Eines Tages könnte es uns ja vielleicht nützlich sein, seine Verbündeten im Unklaren gelassen zu haben.
Disproving these rumors was difficult, as in the following years the American intelligence services received numerous reports of alleged sightings of Hitler. They were not given much importance, but the secrecy with which these reports were treated made the myth permeate the general public. For some people, Hitler's escape was a real possibility. The fear that the infamous figure would reappear and spread his ideology was alive. But the reality was that his remains, those of his wife and those of the Goebbels family, had been buried in an East German village since 1946, except, according to rumors, a fragment of the dictator's skull and some teeth. These were kept by Stalin in his desk in the Moscow Kremlin. Only 3 years after the death of the Soviet leader was a formal death certificate issued for Hitler. What remained of his body was exhumed in 1970 and destroyed by the Russians. According to the final report, it was completely incinerated and ground with pieces of coal until it was pulverized into pulverized ash. Then, he was thrown into the river. Only in 2018, scientists from other countries were allowed to analyze the bones kept by the Soviets and confirm their identification once and for all. Hitler was dead, and his enemies made sure that his ideology would follow in his footsteps. 10% of the German population, around 8 million people, were or had been members of the National Socialist Party. Many tens of millions more belonged to organizations associated with it. Although their leader had been wiped off the map, his ideas lived on in many of these men, women, and children. In the months following the German surrender, the Allies and Soviets began a process of denazification. This sought to erase any kind of Nazi influence in the culture, society, and politics within Germany and Austria, where the Führer had been born. To this end, the entire population was screened for any trace of sympathy for Nazism. But this would be an incredibly difficult mission to accomplish, as a historian tells us in the following video.
What happens is that there are so many people who've made their peace with the Nazi regime, who've been complicit in the Nazi regime, who've been involved in perpetration on behalf of Nazism, that it really is a massive problem.
They quickly realized the impossibility of this task, although a large number of arrests did take place. The Nuremberg trials and subsequent convictions were part of this process. To prevent party ideas from being promulgated through the media, a high level of censorship was applied to radio, newspapers, films, and plays. Books, from fiction to poetry, were banned, and existing copies were confiscated and destroyed. Also, the Western powers planned to eliminate Germany's industrial capacity, practically reverting it to an agricultural model. But they feared that this would lead to such a level of resentment in the civilian population that communism would come to be seen as a friendly ideology. It already ruled over half the country, and the Allies wanted to prevent its spread almost as much as Nazism. The economic sanctions ended up being moderate enough not to turn the majority of German citizens against each other. Thus, with the death of the Führer, Germany went from being the sworn enemy of both the Western Allies and the Soviet Communists to one of the main interests of both in the new Cold War. The two sides would fight over the country continuously throughout the second half of the 20th century, until the dissolution of the Soviet Union at the end of the century. We have reached the end of the video, and we want to ask you, Do you think Stalin's secrecy regarding Hitler's death was justified? We await your response in the comments box, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.